So I wrote a book about failure. And the first question that people ask you when you tell them that you are writing a book about failure is why, right? It's kind of a bummer. And the first answer that I give is write what you know. And I have had a lot of failure in my life. I nearly flunked out of high school. I nearly flunked out of college. I got my act together, managed to get myself into a great business school. And then I got a job in my second year. The great thing about going to business school, for any of you who do this, is that at a school like Chicago, recruiting is such a well-oiled machine that I had already received all of the job offers I would have by October of my second year of school, and I had accepted a job by February. So I was set. I had a nice job at a management consulting firm, six-figure salary. I could live anywhere in the country I wanted as long as it was near an airport. And so I enjoyed the rest of my semester taking interesting classes, hanging out with people. I directed the Follies at my business school. I wrote the gossip column at the business school newspaper. And I prepared to go out into the world with my Chicago MBA and become a management consultant. And then in 2001, everything kind of went to heck, as some of you may remember. It was actually, the bad decisions started with me. I was actually, remember when the NASDAQ crashed? Many of you don't because you were like in grade school. But those of you who are like me with gray hair and who were born back in the Paleolithic, in March of 2000, the NASDAQ crashed, putting an end to the stock market bubble. I actually watched that crash from the lobby of Merrill Lynch's training facility, where I had been flown at great expense to Merrill Lynch to do 2 days of orientation for the summer associate program that I entered into as an intern. Despite that fact, I decided to spend my summer in the technology investment banking group at Merrill Lynch. That was a very bad decision. They didn't have any work. So the great thing about investment banking is that you spend all of this time just showing people that you would be working if there were any work to do. So I would get into work at 9 and I would leave work at 11 p.m. having done basically nothing in between that. I read all of the back issues of every magazine I could think of online. I wrote long letters to friends. I occasionally went out to intern lunches. Other than that, there was no work. So having observed that the tech industry seemed to be moribund, I naturally decided to accept a job with a technology management consulting firm. And I did this because it felt comfy. Business school is for people who want things to be easy is not quite the right word because they're very hardworking people, but well-defined, well-structured, and practically guaranteed. And that was what a Chicago MBA was supposed to be. Basically, it was supposed to be like the next best thing to a guarantee of a good job for the rest of your life, right? So I get out, and just before we're about to graduate, the management consultant firm calls me and says, "There's been a little slowdown in business. You still have a job. We're just pushing your start date back a few months. You were supposed to start in October. How does February sound?" So I said, okay. I called my parents. I was like, "Mommy, can I come home for a few months?" Luckily for me, I was extraordinarily fortunate because my parents lived in Manhattan. And so they had a nice apartment in Manhattan. I moved into the spare bedroom there. And then some lunatics drove planes into the World Trade Center, and the towers came down. And for funny reasons, some of my dad's clients were doing some of the disaster recovery work down there. So I ended up working in a trailer at Ground Zero. And while I was in this trailer, which was 30 degrees below zero in my particular little area, I exaggerate, but I was directly beneath the air intake valve. And so I just sit there all the time with all these layers on. Luckily, I was from Chicago, so I knew. And then one day I was walking past a plate glass window, and I was like, "Who is that obese person walking next to me?" And I was like, "That's me," because I had 9 layers of everything that I owned on top of me. So I'm working down there, and they called it. They were like, "Business has been a little slower than expected. You were supposed to start in February. How about March? How about May? How about May?" And so I said, okay, and I told my parents I might be there for a little while longer, and then eventually they called me and were like, "So how about never? Does never work?" They laid off my entire associate class. None of us had ever worked there. They just fired us all. And they dumped us back on the job market after the people in the class behind us were already done recruiting. And I made then another bad decision, which was that I did not immediately quit my job down at Ground Zero and start looking for another job. Instead, I sort of strung along there for a year. And I had a really hard time. I was the master of almost getting jobs. I almost got like a lot of great jobs. I almost got a job with the city of New York as a director of their IT system, because that's what I did before I went to business school. I did get into the Foreign Service. I went all the way through the whole process and was ready to be posted, and then I flunked the medical at the very last minute. And this got longer and longer, and I'm living at home, and I turned 30, which is exactly as lame as it sounds. And at the sort of nadir of this, and I had all of these job interviews. I interviewed with banks, I interviewed with consulting firms, I interviewed with The Economist, because I'd met someone at a cocktail party who worked there. Nothing, and I got no answer from any of these places. I sent out 1,400 resumes. I got one response from a woman who lived in Wyoming, who pointed out that I did not live in Wyoming, and also did not actually seem to be qualified for the job that I had applied for. It was like this gesture I had to make to the universe. I was doing what I was supposed to. I went to informational interviews. I sent out resumes. I tapped my network. But my network was in technology. And for example, one guy who I'd worked with had made $750,000 in the year 2000. He made zero in 2001. So it was a very bad environment. And I was starting, honestly, I was really down. Long-term unemployment is basically the worst thing that can happen to you in a Western democracy short of death or dismemberment. Everything else you recover from. So when you look at people who get divorced, you look at people who are widowed, after 5 years, they're basically as happy as they were before this happened. In fact, widows are slightly happier, which may be telling us something. But I went ahead and got married anyway after finding this statistic. But unemployment we don't recover from. If you're unemployed in year 5, you're basically just as unhappy as you were in year 1. It is a terrible, terrible thing. It disconnects you from the whole world of work. It disconnects you from, you think about what's the first thing most Americans ask you when you meet them, right? What do you do? If you're a student, not yet. Where do you go to school? But I guarantee this, like two minutes after you graduate, this is coming. What do you do? I didn't have an answer for that. And I was broke. I was really broke. I was wearing clothes that were stretched and stained and had holes in them and didn't fit, and I couldn't afford to replace them. And it was funny, I told this story, and my dad was like, why didn't you ask us for money? And it like just never occurred to me, right? Because it never occurred to me that I would be someone who needed to ask for money. I'd gone to an Ivy League school undergrad. I had a good job before I went to business school. I'd gone to a good business school, and I just didn't have the idea that you could just go and ask your parents for money and they would give it to you, because I'd never needed to do that before. And at the worst moment, I went out to a happy hour for my business school classmates, and all of them like had jobs. They weren't living at home, and they were having babies and getting married. And I'm just circulating with my glass of water because I couldn't actually afford to buy a drink, and feeling worse and worse and worse about myself. And finally, this guy who I barely knew at school, because it's a fairly big school, walked in and he was like, "Hey, Megan, how are you?" And I was like, "I am perilously close to despair." Right, and he did about what you would do if someone did that to you at a cocktail party. He was like, and then he just kind of sidled away from me because I think he was afraid to turn his back on. I think he was actually afraid to turn his back on me. And about a week after this happened, I would guess, a couple weeks after this happened. Unfortunately, I didn't know I was going to write a book, so I didn't take notes at the time. But very shortly afterwards, I get a call. I'm at home. I'm playing video games and feeling very depressed. And I got a call. I pick up the phone, and there's a British guy at the other end. And he said, "Hello, is Megan there?" And I'm sorry, I do really bad British accent. But I said, "Yes." And he said, "This is Anthony Gottlieb." And this was the guy from The Economist who I'd interviewed with 3 months before and heard nothing from. And I was totally flabbergasted. I didn't know what to say. I was like, "Hi, how are you?" He was like, "Well, actually, I'm calling to offer you the job." And I was like, "I'll take it." Anthony Gottlieb is a very reserved man. And he said, "Oh, well, that's splendid. We were thinking of paying you $40,000 a year." I was like, "You're going to pay me?" Then I realized I sounded like a moron. And we like hashed out the details. I agreed to start in 2 weeks. Then I hung up the phone and I called this guy I'd been dating. And I said I got a job, and I started crying. And I'm not like the kind of person who like I see an insurance commercial and I just lose it, right? Like a Lifetime movie, I've got the box of tissues. I've cried in happiness exactly one other time in my life, and that was on my wedding day. And my bridesmaid made me stop because I was going to run my mascara. But this was the end of the worst period in my life. And the reason I tell you this story is not just that I like to do 5 good minutes of stand-up to, to warm up the crowd, is that actually what I realized only much later is that had I not had those 2 years, I could not have taken that job. Because I had $100,000 in student loans when I graduated. I had $1,000 in loan payments that I had to make every month. This job was in New York, where I lived. New York is very expensive. And it was really, really tough for a long time. I spent a lot of time eating ramen and cheese doodle surprise, where the surprise is you're 31 and still having ramen and cheese doodles for dinner. And I couldn't have made that decision if I hadn't had those 2 years of misery, of total despair, before I gave up. And here's the thing. When I was 8, I decided I wanted to be a writer. And I wrote a lot. One of the reasons I nearly flunked out of college was I was too busy writing my really, really terrible novel that I think may actually have been the worst novel ever penned in the English language. And then I stopped because it wasn't safe. I wanted something that was a safe career, something you could rely on. Right? So I went into technology in the 90s, I went to business school. My colleagues at The Economist ultimately dubbed me Miss Zeitgeist because I seemed to have participated in every major trend of the last 15 years. Then I started a blog, back when blogging was something that cool people did and not something that your grandmother has to keep track of her recipes. I couldn't have done it, I couldn't have taken the risk. When I decided that maybe I would become a freelance journalist, because the story actually started a little earlier, which was that I had a lot of things going, right? I was doing some technology consulting on the side. I was doing various little things, none of which had turned into a full-time career. But I started this blog down at Ground Zero. And I started writing about economics and business school curriculum because that's what I knew about, that no one else was writing about. And it turned out no one else was writing about this. Either I or Brad DeLong started the first economics blog on the web. And over time, I built up an audience. And then people started offering me freelance things. And I wrote my first article for Salon in 2002. And then I wrote another one. I remember the feeling of turning in my first article for Salon and thinking, wow, that's amazing, someone has printed me. And then all of a sudden, every journalist has gone through this. You go from 1 minute thinking, wow, this is amazing. And then you're like, wait a minute, who's writing all those other articles I read? If they're letting me do this. But I love writing. I'd always loved writing. This is my dream job. When I talk to people from business school and they're like, I love my job, often what they mean is I don't even think about slitting my wrists when I'm on the way to work, right? I get up and I'm excited to go to work every day. I would never have dared to do this. When I decided to become a freelance journalist, among one of my many things, my parents reacted about the same way you would if your child had a $100,000 business school education and had announced that she was going to join the most unstable and low-paid industry available to college graduates. And my dad actually said, so how would you think about this as a business school problem? I was like, you gotta be kidding me. No, seriously, how would you analyze this? I said, I don't know, I would do a discounted cash flow. I would project out my future earnings, and then I would discount them because $1 tomorrow is worth less than $1 today. And I would get a number, and then I would look and see if that's a positive or negative. And he was like, do that. And I was like, really? He's like, please. So I sat down and I did my little net present value calculation. And as I recall, it had about the same expected value as becoming addicted to crack. But I did it anyway, which is probably how not a few addictions start. And that decision ended up being the best decision of my life. But I was only free to do it when I had exhausted the safe things. It turns out that actually being completely passionate about something and wanting to do it almost every waking hour, not every waking hour, I also like premium television, but most waking hours is a really good guide to something that you may well be good at getting paid for. Because you care a lot about it, you've been doing it for a long time. It actually took me 6 years to get paid for blogging. I went to The Economist as a web editor there. The Atlantic ultimately hired me to blog. And now my day is I wake up and I'm like, what do I want to write about? And then I just write about it. I have total autonomy. It's an amazing job. But I couldn't have gotten it if I hadn't been so totally racked with despair that I was willing to try anything. There's an old Janis Joplin song, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. This is actually true. I don't want to say that like failure feels good. It doesn't. It feels terrible. I still remember, and when I started writing the book, because I can be kind of funny about it now because it's a long time ago. But when I started writing the book, and I was like, I'll tell my funny stories about being unemployed, and you guys haven't even heard the half of them. But then when I went through it, I realized it feels awful still. A lot of the stories in the book are stories about me being unemployed, me having the guy who had just announced he wanted to marry me dump me 3 days later, the time my mother almost died. And even after you've glossed them over, just going back and trying to write out what happened feels awful. Failure does feel bad. But here's the thing, failure has to feel bad. Failure is nature's way of telling you, stop, that doesn't work. If it didn't feel bad, we wouldn't stop. We would just keep doing the same thing, trying to get different results, which is, of course, the technical definition of insanity, right? Failure is, in fact, the way that we learn. And I mean this really seriously, is if you look at how we actually learn something about the universe, look at how a kid learns to walk, right? What does it mostly look like? Phoom, right? They kind of crawl up, phoom. They fall down a lot more than they walk for a long time, or what seems like a long time to their horrified mother, who is watching their child repeatedly pummel herself on the floor. And then eventually they get it. Well, this is how the brain learns. So the brain makes a prediction about what's going to happen. When I do this, I'm going to get this result. And then it tries, and then it gets either positive or negative feedback. Either it worked or it didn't. And when it worked, you get a little flash of, hey, that's great. And when it doesn't, then you get a little, oh, I didn't like that so much. And that over time, iteration and repetition is how we get most of the information that we have about the world. We'd like to think that we can just learn by studying great thoughts and so forth, but think about when you learn to play tennis, right? It's not about understanding how tennis works. If that were true, the MIT tennis team would win Wimbledon every year, right? You just get the physics department in there, and right? That actually isn't how it works. How it works is you try something, and the ball, how many people have tried to learn a new sport in the last 10 years? Yeah, okay, a few. And you know the feeling, right? Like you try to do something, and it looks really easy when the people who know how to do it are doing it, and then you do it, and you're like, what the heck just happened? And you do that 10 or 30 or 50 or 100 or 1,000 times, and then kind of by accident, occasionally you do it correctly. And often you don't actually know what you did. I always think about this with learning to ski. When I learned to ski, I was relatively old. I was 11. And so I would learn, and I wouldn't know what I'd done right, but occasionally things would go right. Trying over and over again is how you figure that out. This is also how economies learn. So there's a guy named Peter Skillman. He's the head of, he is no longer, but he was at the time, the head of user experience for Palm, which before there was an iPhone was the thing that people used to carry around in their hands to keep their appointments. And he actually, did some revolutionary stuff. One of the things that he did was he started studying how organizations do things, how they innovate. And so one of the experiments he did was that he went out into the community and he started giving groups of people a task. He gave them 25 strands of spaghetti, he gave them some tape, and he gave them an egg. Sorry, a marshmallow. And he said, I want you to build me the tallest structure capable of supporting a marshmallow. So some of the groups that are good at this are not surprising. Singaporean engineers turn out to be very good at building tall structures capable of supporting a weight. Some of the groups that aren't good at this, also not surprising, MBAs, I am sad to report, come in dead last. Apparently they spend all of their time arguing about who is going to be the CEO of Spaghetti Inc. But here's one group that you would not expect, the absolute best group, according to Skillman. And I saw him give this talk in 2007, and I've seen it since on the web. You can look it up on the web. It's a great talk. Flashes it up on the screen. It's kindergartners. Half of them don't have any teeth, and they're sitting in front of these amazing structures. The engineering things, Singaporean engineers, all looks like the Eiffel Tower. The kindergartners, it looks like an Escher drawing. You cannot believe that this thing even stands up, much less supports a marshmallow. So why were the kindergartners so good? A couple of reasons. First of all, they're in kindergarten, so they're not yet familiar with the concept of rules. So they're the only group who asked for more spaghetti. And you could have more spaghetti, but no one else asked. But the really powerful thing is what they did with that spaghetti. What they did with that spaghetti is iteration and experimentation. They would try something, and if it didn't work, they'd destroy it, and they'd start over. And they just did that over and over and over again. And through this evolutionary process, they'd change one thing, and if it didn't make it better, they would take that off and try again. Over and over and over. That's the process that evolution uses. That's the process that markets use. It is the process that companies who want to succeed fast use, is Skillman's argument. It says if you want to succeed, you need to fail quickly. Because that is the fastest way to find out what doesn't work. When you're doing something that you have never done before, the only way to find out whether it's going to work is not to sit there and develop an elaborate theory of tennis ball physics, or to look into, as he said, very few people are familiar with the structural properties of spaghetti. So going out on the web to do some research is probably not going to help. What helps is trying it. What happens when I do this? Oh, that worked. Oh, that didn't. We don't like this message, right? Because as I say, failure feels bad. It has to, but that doesn't make it any more fun. And so we try to engineer our lives to have less failure, right? We try to make ourselves safe, to wall ourselves off from the things that could go wrong so that we're only doing things that have a guarantee. But the message of my book, and a message that I've heard over and over from entrepreneurs, from economists, from almost any profession you can imagine, there is nothing as dangerous as safe. Think about a guaranteed safe bet, right? Housing in 2005. Was there anything safer? Everyone in America is hearing from their parents, don't rent, buy. You're throwing your money away. You need to build equity. Everyone is hearing this is a guaranteed way. You can enjoy granite countertops and also be saving for retirement at the same time. It's a win-win, right? The moment at which everyone believed that they had stumbled onto a sure thing was precisely the moment at which they were building up the forces that would destroy a fairly significant chunk of the American economy. And that's not an accident. In our quest for safety, in our quest for a guarantee, we end up deceiving ourselves, right? What happens when you think that nothing can go wrong? You're not prepared for it, right? You go all in on bets that are actually incredibly risky. It's just that you're not perceiving the risk. That's a little bit what I did with technology. It felt comfy, right? I had done this before. It felt like a sure thing because, after all, I knew how technology worked. I had experience in it. And I had an MBA from the University of Chicago. What could possibly go wrong? And it was the moment at which I wasn't frightened. The moment at which I wasn't preparing for, okay, there are bad alternatives that I got myself into trouble. So one of the things that I did on this project was I went down to Memphis. So fun fact, Memphis, Tennessee is the bankruptcy capital of the world. And we know this because America is the bankruptcy capital of the world, and Memphis, Tennessee is the bankruptcy capital of America. Something over 1% of the population of Memphis declares bankruptcy every year. If that number held true throughout most of the population, all of you would, about 70% of the people that you knew would have declared bankruptcy at some point in their lives. Or you could expect that they would by the time they died. So this is an extraordinary number, and I went down to see what goes on. And it turns out a lot of different things go on. Bankruptcy is insurance for poor people. Not for totally poor people. Totally poor people don't have access to credit, and so bankruptcy doesn't do them any good. For those of you who don't know exactly what bankruptcy is, you walk into court and a judge basically arranges for you to pay less than you owe on your debts because you can't, because you don't have enough money to make the payments. So I went down, but one of the things they told me, one surprising group of people who had been showing up in court a lot since the housing bubble popped, doctors and lawyers. So why them? I mean, these guys have great incomes, right? They've got a professional certificate that should be basically a guarantee of a good job. Well, she said, what happens is they act like they've got a guarantee. And they spend like they've got a guarantee. And they take on a mortgage like they've got a guarantee. And then they get sick in their 50s. And they've got that big mortgage and they can't work. And this is a huge source of it. You see this in bankruptcy courts. There's basically three groups of people who declare bankruptcy. I should say 4 groups of people. So the first group is poor people. They're the majority. The majority of people who declare bankruptcy are living close to the income line. They just don't have room in their budgets. They take on credit because buying sort of very basic things like a car that will get you to and from work is not something that they can cash flow or something they have difficulty cash flowing. So they tend to have debt right up to the edge of their income, and then if their hours get cut back at work or so forth, they get into trouble pretty quickly. Second group is medical. It's not as big a group as you would think from reading a lot of the headlines. And also, the source is actually not usually the medical bills. Medical bills can usually be renegotiated with the hospital because if you declare bankruptcy, they get nothing. So they're usually willing to work with you. The big source is that loss of income. Third group of people is people who have a compulsive spending problem. There's a small percentage of the population that just can't handle access to credit. And so when you see someone who has a six-figure income who's declared bankruptcy twice, that's usually someone who just, like, they can't control themselves around credit cards. It's an addiction, basically just the same as can't control yourself around alcohol or can't control yourself around gambling. It's a small group of people, but a disproportionate number of people who declare bankruptcy. And then the fourth group is small businessmen. So when you look at these groups, the medical people are often people who had medical debt, who have a medical event, and it's the loss of income, not the medical bills per se, that drive them into bankruptcy. If you're a plumber or a doctor, if you don't have disability insurance, and I would like to urge everyone in this room who is not a student and does not have disability insurance to spare no time running to get it after the end of this session, because it's the most underused form of insurance in the country. Those kinds of failures, the people who are most prone to them are the people who figure, I'm a surgeon. I can always work. And it's true, you always can unless you get sick. So when my husband and I bought our house, right before I started writing this book, we actually did a kind of odd exercise. We said, okay, what would happen, because the bank is willing to lend you an insane amount of money. And I'm not talking about like some crazy subprime loan. This was in 2010, and it was my credit union, which basically was like, yeah, sure, we'll give you 5 times your annual income. I was on the phone with them, and I was like, oh my God. And my husband said, what, we're not going to get the house? I was like, no, we can buy 2. But we actually sat down and said, okay, what would happen if we both lost our jobs? And then we both had to take jobs that paid half as much. How much mortgage could we afford then? And that's mostly because I spent 2 years being unemployed, and I'm maybe slightly paranoid from the experience. But also because I'd been thinking a lot about how people get themselves into trouble. How do they get themselves into trouble? Thinking you have a guarantee and assuming fixed obligations based on those guarantees, whatever they are. When you're not prepared for something to go wrong, that is when you get yourself into the most trouble. So we wanted a mortgage that realistically either one of us could support or we could both support on a reduced income. Here's what I didn't predict, though, at that time, was how freeing that lower mortgage payment would be. How much easier it made to take other risks that had high potential payoffs, like leaving a safe job at the Atlantic and going to Newsweek. That was something that was a lot easier to do because I knew that no matter what happened, I could get some sort of a job and that we would be able to make that mortgage payment every month. So ultimately, to wrap up, I'm going to wrap up and open up to questions. The message that I'm trying to take away, that I want people to take away from this, is that failure, I love those movies that say failure is not an option, right? It's a great line. No, wrong. Failure is always an option. The universe is always holding that card, and they will feel free to play it at any moment. The question is not how do you avoid failure, because I think the metaphor for our age, especially for middle-class people like the ones in this room, is the disappearance of the jungle gym from playgrounds. Right? So when I was growing up, for those of you, I can't believe I've now reached the age where I'm telling young people how it was in my day. But when I was growing up on the mean streets of New York's Upper West Side, jungle gyms were like 8 feet tall, which I know because they were over my dad's head, and my dad is 6'7". And there was no padding. It was just metal bars on concrete. And we climbed all over this. And the best feeling in the entire world was when you got to the top of that jungle gym. And you tried a bunch of times before you made it, because you would get halfway up, and then you would wuss out. But eventually, one day, to the envy of some of your younger friends, you would make it to the top. And it was the first time you really got to feel like you had achieved something daring. You had conquered some small piece of the world and like overcome your fear and gotten to the top. And then we decided that was too much liability, so we took out the jungle gyms and we made everything this tall. And we put padding under them just in case they should fall 3 feet and sprain a toe. When we took away the jungle gyms, we took away some risk of a broken arm. We also took away that feeling of achievement. And this actually shows up. So you would think that kids who fall would be afraid of heights. It's actually not true. The kids who fall are less afraid of heights than the kids who don't. And this goes on throughout college. We've tried, throughout high school and even into college, we've tried so hard to take all of the failure out of our kids' lives, sitting over them at every moment lest they manage to screw up. I gave this talk at Microsoft in March, and a girl came up to me afterwards. She was 15 years old. She was a 10th grader, and she said, look, I understand what you're saying, but I'm in an international baccalaureate program. Only 5% of us are going to get 4.0s. I just can't afford to take a class I'm not going to get an A in. So you're 15 years old and you can't afford to take a risk because it might derail your future? America, you are doing it wrong. 15 is supposed to be the time when you can try things and screw up. And I mentioned this to my dad, and he said, you know, we had a concerted policy of letting you make mistakes because when was going to be a better time? When you're ready to splash out on a like really edgy assisted living facility? This is the time when we should be teaching people to fail well. And instead, we're taking the failure out of schools until they get to a giant pass-fail, do I get into the college I want at the age of 18? Before that, we're tamping down failure, inflating grades, compressing grade distributions, anything not to say this is better and this is worse and make people feel bad. And then they're unprepared for what happens in the real world where people are not always forgiving. But here's the thing. Like, it does feel bad. But the thing you learn by failing as a little kid is like those kids who fell off the jungle gym. The thing that you learn is, okay, well, I can live through that. The most terrifying thing is the failure you've never experienced because no one let you. Because then it's the unknown, right? What is the scariest thing in a horror movie? It's the thing you've never seen. Once you see the villain, it's actually substantially less scary, right? Because now it's just an actor in makeup. But before you see it, it could be every terrible thing that you have ever imagined at 3 a.m. The worst nightmares I ever have, I'm being stalked by something and I don't know what it is, right? We've done that to kids in the name of making them safer. And I talk to my friends who grew up. I walked to school by myself at the age of 9 through housing projects, and that was totally normal. My mother actually, I asked her once if she'd sort of had an idea of walking me to school. She was like, oh my God, you would have killed me, right? In the age of 4th grade, you were allowed to walk to school in New York City. And this was when Manhattan was really dangerous. I talked to people who grew up this way. And they're like, oh, I could never. What if something happened? You would think that the attrition rate in our generation was at least 30%. Where actually, in fact, none of my classmates, they all made it to adulthood alive. I mean, you see this now with the mothers who were getting arrested for leaving their kids in the car. I was reading one of these stories and I was like, that's terrible. She left a kid in the car with the windows closed and it was August and it was 83 degrees and then I realized the kid was 12. Like, 12-year-old children do not sit in cars and broil to death. They can exit the car. If your child doesn't know how to operate the door, you have larger problems. Fine. But what's really striking to me is that the police officers who are making these arrests and the counselors who are enacting these regulations, none of their mothers would have dreamed of taking them with them everywhere they went until they reached the legal drinking age in their state. We are setting up these expectations for a failure-free life that are in fact incredibly limiting, that are in fact depriving people of the experiences that they need to do the most important thing that they are going to need to know to do in their lives, and that is how to take risks and how to fail. Because that is, if you know that, you can learn anything else. You can find out, you can get some spaghetti and tape and make it happen. If you don't know how to do that, you're going to be trapped in the same box the MBAs were, trying to get on the right path, right career path to be the CEO of the tiny spaghetti-making organization. So I'll close by saying, I wonder about the way that schools teach failure. When I think about this with I was an English major undergraduate. And I think about the way that you learn literature, right? A teacher gives you a great work, and then you read it, and then you meditate upon how great it is. And so a couple years back, I was at a conference on Moby Dick with a bunch of English professors and me. Do not ask how I got to this conference, it's a long story. Anyway, so we're reading chapter 25 of Moby Dick, which has this, it's actually kind of a really fascinating explanation of the rules for determining whether you were allowed to hunt a whale or whether some other ship has claimed it. And at the end of this, there's this wonderful because it's a fast fish or a loose fish. You can hunt a loose fish, you can't hunt a fast fish. At the end of this chapter, Melville says, "And what are you, dear reader, but a fast fish and a loose fish too?" And everyone's discussing kind of very earnestly what this meant. And I raised my hand and I said, I'm just gonna throw this out there, but maybe he just got to the end of the chapter and he was stuck and he thought it sounded cool. A couple other professors in there, you would have thought I'd been like, so hey guys, after the session is over, what if we just went out and stabbed some old ladies? Here's the thing, if you are a writer, every single writer in the entire world has gotten to the end of something, didn't know how to end it, and was like, I don't know, this sounds hazily grand. Let's throw it out there and see if the editor will accept it. We give kids an idea of literature where it's this amazing thing that emerges from the minds of geniuses. In fact, if you are a working writer, or if you read the works of people like Melville and Mark Twain in their lesser eras, or their drafts, what you see is people who are struggling and stumbling and don't know what they're doing, and half of the stuff they end up with is random, and they don't really know what it means. But they do it, they're doing the best they can, they think they've got something pretty good at the end, but how they got there was not, unless you were Flaubert, a master plan. Maybe Anthony Trollope, who was amazing, he worked for the British government, he wrote exactly from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. every morning, and if he finished at like 6:45, he would pull out another piece of paper and be like, chapter 1, and just keep going. Most writers aren't like that. Science. How are we taught science, right? It's all of these geniuses wandering around. How many people know that Linus Pauling was a vitamin C nut and ascribed to it kind of semi-miraculous powers of curing colds, which it doesn't have? Or that Isaac Newton dabbled in alchemy. We do learn about some of the mistakes. Do you guys remember spontaneous combustion? Right? So we learn about this as these morons who thought something incredibly stupid. In fact, often the people who thought this incredibly stupid thing were very good scientists who made other contributions to science. Science and progress and writing and anything else that is difficult and worthwhile is not a matter of geniuses sitting down with a plan, executing that plan flawlessly, and then going out to dinner. It is a matter of human beings who were flawed and frightened, who managed to do something great anyway. And that's what everyone from the age of 2 to the age of 65, the age of 85, to the age of 100, needs to learn how to do better, because that is actually the key to personal growth. It's also the key to economic growth. It's the key to running a good company and a good life. And I'll close there and open for questions.